Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. On day 2 of what Israel is calling Operation Iron Wall, gunfire and explosions rocking the West Bank city of Jenin. The raid has left at least 10 dead, staff and patients at one point trapped for hours inside of a local hospital. It's all happening just days after the truce in Gaza went into effect. More on that story now.
As Israeli tanks rolled into Jenin on Tuesday, medics scrambled to treat the wounded. It began what Israel called a significant operation to eradicate terrorism in the occupied West Bank. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu added it was part of a broader strategy to counter Iran, which supports militant groups including Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
We are acting systematically and resolutely against the Iranian axis wherever it extends its arms, in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Judea and Samaria.
Islamic Jihad vowed to fight back against the latest operation, saying Israel launched it after failing to achieve its goals in Gaza. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, several people were killed in the raids, and medics said they treated a number of people wounded by gunshots. The Palestinian security forces and Jenin residents accused Israel of targeting civilians.
There's a sniper in the Rabia building. Anyone he sees passing by, man, women, or a little girl, he shoots. He has already hit 6 people, and I've seen it. Even a public services car went by, and he shot at it.
The operation came just 2 days after a ceasefire in Gaza, and the violence is raising concerns, with the head of the United Nations urging Israel to exercise maximum restraint. Violence throughout the West Bank has soared since Hamas's October 7 attacks in 2023. According to the Health Ministry, Israeli troops or settlers have killed more than 800 Palestinians, while some 30 Israelis have been killed in Palestinian attacks or during Israeli army raids.
Our coverage begins in Jerusalem. Correspondent Noga Tarnopovsky is there. Noga, what's the latest?
Well, the latest is that we have quite a bit of confusion about this raid. This is the third Israeli major military operation in Jenin since the war started. And the Israeli army spokesperson who gave a press conference a little bit earlier today was basically unable to respond to 2 questions. One, does this mean that the previous operations have failed? If this is a third one, he tried to describe this as sort of a bit of cleaning house of police, kind of constant police work. And then responding to a question relating to the prime minister's statement that Iranian arms have infiltrated into the West Bank, he did not actually make a concrete claim that we're dealing with Iranian arms. On the other hand, the most recent fighting in Jenin, as recent as around 10 days ago, was a Palestinian Authority forces operation against these same Jenin brigades. So right now in Israel, there are many, many questions. Among them, the uncomfortable political question: is Prime Minister Netanyahu trying to transmit to Israelis that he's still a wartime prime minister and there's still a war to be handled, even when there is a ceasefire with Hezbollah in the north and so far truce that is holding vis-a-vis Hamas in the south?
But we saw, for instance, in that statement that was in the report, referring to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which is the language used by settlers and those who want Israel to annex all of the Palestinian territories. Just how much of of the Israeli population would like to make a grab for the West Bank?
Not a lot of the Israeli population is interested in the kind of annexation that you're talking about. Some of Netanyahu's most prominent ministers are interested in that. The language, using the term Judea and Samaria, the biblical terms for this area, this is true. It has become a kind of lingua franca in Israel recently, and certainly it's a symbol for the prime minister to refer to it that way. It's important probably to note that under Israeli law, the West Bank remains occupied territory. It is not part of the state of Israel. And so this is kind of using a political line, political wink to his base. What we are seeing, though, are some of Netanyahu's ministers and cronies making all kind of statements that seem to indicate that they don't want the ceasefires to last, and that they definitely want more of a free hand to do whatever they would like in the West Bank. This is following night after night of really catastrophic, I would say, anarchic scenes of West Bank settlers rampaging in the West Bank, setting homes and cars on fire in the village of Turmus Aya near Nablus, in other sites. So what we're seeing is growing violence and a government that doesn't know exactly which way to take it. I think in part they're waiting to hear from the Trump administration. Again, there are mixed messages. President Trump's new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the new ambassador to the UN, Elise Stefanik, have said that the entire West Bank was handed by God to the Jews. It belongs to Israel, as if it were already Israeli, and yet the US government hasn't changed its official position. This is occupied territory.
Stay with us, Noga Tarnapovsky, because I want to turn to Washington now. And Palestinian human rights attorney Zaha Hassan, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank. Zaha, thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me.
So Donald Trump surprised Benjamin Netanyahu, it seems, by pushing back and insisting that there be a deal on Gaza. Is he ready to give Netanyahu everything he wants when it comes to the West Bank?
Well, look, I mean, what we've seen already is a president who is very close to the settler movement. He has filled his administration with individuals who are very supportive of a greater Israel. So obviously, with that kind of signaling, it's clear that the settlement movement is going to be treated well under the Trump administration. In fact, one of his first orders of business was to issue an executive order to repeal or to remove the sanctions that were on the few Israeli settlers that were considered violent and problematic in terms of the pursuit of a two-state solution. So all that we have seen already in this very short time since the Trump administration has taken over the helm of government in the U.S. is that the settler movement and the greater Israel designs of Netanyahu and also of his governing coalition will be supported.
Will be supportive, and is the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a wild card on this issue?
No, I think it's, former Senator Rubio was very supportive of, as well of Israel, very critical of the notion of Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood. But at the end of the day, what matters in the Trump administration is not the State Department. The Israel-Palestine policy is going to be set by the White House, and the White House is going to have a very hands-on approach when it comes to Israel. And it's going to be those closest to President Trump that will be determinative. Now, he has an envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, who has been effective in terms of the willingness that he's shown in getting the ceasefire over the finish line to threaten the use of U.S. leverage. And so the question is, will this deal maker, will this individual who is now the envoy also be willing to use that leverage to pull back Israel when it needs to be pulled back, when it moves into excess, which it has been prone to do, and we've seen it in terms of the destruction that has been wrought over Gaza.
Let's talk about Gaza for a second and cross back to Jerusalem and correspondent Noga Tarnapovsky there. You know, we're always wondering, because it is day 4 of the truce, it is holding, and my question is a simple one. Is the government of Benjamin Netanyahu testing the terms of the truce? So you heard Zaha mention how Steve Witkoff applied pressure. Is he testing the terms when we get this statement saying that Israeli forces will stay at the Rafah border crossing with Egypt during the first phase of the ceasefire?
Right. Well, we learned quite a few details about the ceasefire agreement today that Benjamin Netanyahu would have preferred we not learn. The first one is simply that discussions are already underway. We also know that Steve Witkoff is already on his way back here. So, what we found out today from Qatari sources is that Israel had accepted that in phase 2, the Palestinian Authority will retake control, which it lost in 2007, of the border between Gaza and Egypt. This is also a firm Egyptian request that Israel not be on its border with Gaza. In response to this, Prime Minister Netanyahu dispatched two of the people closest to him to say no, that it's not the case. One was his right-hand man, Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who wasn't very clear. He just said that's not the case, absolutely not the case. And he said that kind of vague, unaffiliated Gazans are going to be in charge of the border, which is difficult to believe. But then more importantly, one of the voices, I would say, closest to Prime Minister Netanyahu, another minister, David Amsalem, came flat out and said there will not be a stage 2. Stage 2 is crucial. It's when Palestinians are again supposed to regain at least the administration of Gaza, of important forces, and the IDF is supposed to withdraw completely from Gaza in phase 2. So I think what we see testing the waters today are, on the one hand, a government that is pursuing negotiations in Doha, despite the fact that it wanted us to think it wasn't, and at the same time is messaging Israelis, at least, no, 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 we're not going to end this war. We're pushing forward. I think that the next visit, Steve Witkoff's next visit, is going to be a real test of, as Zaha Hassan mentioned, of his use of leverage and of Netanyahu's very difficult choice. Is he going to go now with his right-wing cabinet, or is he going to flow with what the Trump administration has been asking him to do?
So Zaha Hassan, if you are a betting woman, what do you think Steve Witkoff's message to Benjamin Netanyahu will be?
I think it's going to be more listening at this point than it is going to be telling him what to do. I think that what we heard today from Steve Witkoff was that he was amenable even to hearing from Hamas about a diplomatic resolution. So he isn't, as the Biden administration was, so adamant that there could be no, accommodation with Hamas. He didn't say that there wouldn't be an accommodation. He said he would be interested in pursuing a ceasefire with Hamas, and he was, he favored that to continuation of conflict. So it seems that Steve Witkoff is signaling to Hamas as well as to Israel, and now it's going to be up to Israel to explain to Steve Witkoff whether it's serious about continuing through all of the phases of the agreement.
Yeah, because if I hear you correctly, Zaha, the Trump administration is staking now its reputation on there being a phase 2.
Well, I don't know that I would say that, because there's some very troubling signs. We heard that in reporting that there are officials in the Trump administration that were talking about relocating Palestinians to Indonesia, Palestinians from Gaza, because of the devastation that's been wrought. And we've been hearing other statements, including from Steve Witkoff, about the real estate of Gaza and how it could be so beautiful. And obviously, we've heard in the past, before the Trump administration took over from Jared Kushner, his Trump son-in-law, that there could be great development of Gaza, and it didn't sound like that would be for the benefit of Palestinians, but more for resorts and luxury hotels. And so there is a lot of mixed messaging and concern about exactly what the Trump administration envisages for Gaza.
Zaha Hassan, one final question for you. How's this playing in places like Dearborn, Michigan, where Palestinian Americans voted with their feet at times during the last presidential election?
You know, you don't have to go as far as Detroit even or Dearborn to think about the very different ways in which Palestinians are understanding or misunderstanding the new Trump administration. I mean, there have been in Dearborn people that are very much willing to give Trump, you know, a second try. And to see what he might be able to do, because he did manage to force Israel into a ceasefire. There are people in Gaza who are so pleased at having a respite from the bombardment, a respite from the zinning of drones and quadcopters, that you see children holding signs saying, "Thank you, Trump," you know, but there's also many more Palestinians around the world and in the occupied territories, especially those now facing pogroms in the West Bank with settlers run amok, as you saw in the video footage, that are deeply troubled that this might be, you know, the final act for them, and that the peace to prosperity plan that Trump had is now being realized at the end of a gun and at the end of these pogroms. So it's very different. Palestinians are experiencing what's happening in very different ways depending on their contexts.
Zaha Hassan, I want to thank you so much for being with us from Washington.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Noga Tarnapovsky, our correspondent in Jerusalem, who has been with us continuing to cover this story throughout.